Welcome to another segment of Dr. Gregg Talks Story. I'm Dr. Gregg Townsley, and today I'm going to be doing a segment called Created for Community. You know, one of the things that I value so much about Hawaii and the culture here are the values of aloha and ohana. And I have grieved the last couple of years as I have seen some of the forces working within the community to cause a division, disunity and discord based upon separating us into two different classes of people. And my talk today is going to be on Ukraine and some of the things that have happened in that nation that will give you some insight into what we need to watch out for going forward in our own country. Ukraine is a very unique place, and it has been a land that has been fought over many, many times. I'm going to go into an explanation today of why it is that Vladimir Putin believes that he has some sort of a claim to this land. At least this is his justification for it. And also to show that not only is he completely wrong, but in addition to that, he has had evil devices towards Ukraine ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union back in 1990, 1991. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there was Ukraine proclaiming their own independence in August of 1991, and then they had a resolution in December that actually declared them as an independent state. They are a peace-loving people who want to grow into a Western-style democracy. They have struggled with some corruption in leadership, and the biggest thing is that initially, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the person who was put in power was essentially just a pawn of Russia. There was an election held, and the person who was running against this individual was actually poisoned, and this was supposed to be a free election. And people then revolted, and they forced two other votes, and finally in that third vote, they deposed the person who had been placed there by Russia, and the person who had been poisoned actually survived and became the president, and things have gone forward from there as they've tried to develop more and more ties towards Western democracies and towards a style of a government that would give freedom to their people. Right now, they have complete and total religious freedom within their country. There is no repression of any ideologies like there is in Russia. In Russia, there are many, many different religious groups that are not only oppressed, but they are outlawed. And there's a lot of, as you would imagine, in communist Russia, there's a lot of state repression of freedom of thought, freedom of speech, certainly freedom of assembly, etc. The things that in this country we've taken for granted because of our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, but those things are currently under attack in our own country from within by forces that want to move towards bigger government and larger amounts of government control. And this can be a very, very dangerous thing. So I want to tell you about what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union. As of January of 1990, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a human chain that was formed all the way from Kyiv, which is the capital. So it's not pronounced Kiev, although on a lot of Western maps it appears that way. It's actually spelled K-Y-I-V and pronounced Kyiv. And it went all the way to Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk in the western part of the country. This was over 400,000 people making a human chain, holding hands all the way from the capital to the western part of the nation in a solidarity with the desire to become a free people and to break free completely from Soviet control. They were able to do that, and they have been free since 1991. Now Russia is trying to take the country back over. And you might ask, well, why is that? What is it that they see in this nation? If you understand the history of the Soviet Union, of Russia, you realize that Ukraine, as a former member of the Soviet Union, was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. And the entire land is fairly flat. They have mountains on the western side of the country here, and then they have mountains on this side. So the Carpathian Mountains and the Caucasian Mountains here. The country is pretty much just flat agricultural land for the most part. And a major river, the Dnieper, comes and divides the country right down pretty much the center, kind of swings out this way, comes down here at Kherson. And then a major city here on the Black Sea is Odessa. The second largest city in Ukraine is Kharkiv, and it's very close to the Russian border. I was just in this part of the country in September and October. I spent 2 months in Kyiv and made a trip to Sumy out here, which is very close to the Russian border. Right now they're completely surrounded and they're being bombarded. Kharkiv is under air attack and they are being surrounded right now. They are fighting valiantly. These people love freedom, and they are fighting for their families and for their lives. And so today I'm going to give you some more information, and I'm also going to ask for your prayers for the nation of Ukraine. These are peace-loving people. Their army is only defensive. They have actually been fighting the Russians on their eastern border now for some time, and I can show you that here on this other map. This area over here is called the Donbass area, and it's the far eastern edge of Ukraine. As you can see, Ukraine is almost completely surrounded by Russia. And this area of Romania here, this little thin edge of Romania that borders on Ukraine, is also under Russian control. So in 2014, under the Obama administration, they took the Crimean Peninsula. And we really did very little other than, slap them on the wrist as far as the sanctions that were done at that time were basically did nothing to them. At that time, they also invaded this area of the Donbass called Luhansk and Donetsk, and there were over 14,000 Ukrainians who were slaughtered at that time, who were killed in that fighting. These are Russian separatists, some of these people, but in both cases, the actual Russian army came in dressed in a completely different uniform that had no marks on it whatsoever, but they were all identical uniforms. It wasn't like these were people who had locally taken up arms or anything like that, but they wanted to have control of Crimea because of Sevastopol, which has a large submarine station, and they were not happy with some of the conditions that they were getting kind of militarily and agriculturally, financially with Ukraine, and so they actually moved in. They have a bridge that goes from this part of Russia right across. It's actually the opening to the Sea of Azov from the Black Sea. So they actually have now a very long suspension bridge across this area, making this directly connected to Russia, and they've invaded this Donbass area, part of Luhansk and Donetsk. Again, there's been heavy fighting in that area, and Ukraine has been losing their husbands, their brothers, their cousins, their fathers for 8 years now, as they have stood against this Russian incursion on their eastern border. The people of Ukraine are completely and totally against Russia having any further influence in their country. There's been a big disinformation campaign that has been hitting the media in many different ways, and social media as well. And it's being operated by Russia itself. And so I put a shout out to the social media people to do what you said you were doing in the election, and with controlling Russian influence, because right now Russian influence is over the top on this matter, and they're trying to make it look as if they have some reasonable claim to the land of Ukraine. So what is it that Putin has to say about Ukraine and why he has some sort of claim to it? This goes way, way back in history. Putin wrote an entire thesis last summer that basically made the point that they are a common people, that they come from common stock. And to a degree that is true. They are Eastern Slavic people that are descendants from the Scythian peoples that populated the plains of this area. And in this area, this was called ancient Rus. So the Rus people, actually, at one time, the capital of Rus was Kiev, and it was called Kievan Rus at that time. This was way back in history, but reaching back 1,000 years to try to say that you have a claim because you have common heritage would be like us saying that we can take over Canada because we both came out of Britain or England. And that's essentially what he's doing. He's saying we have a common ancestry, therefore we can take their country. That would be exactly like the United States saying we have a right to take over Canada because both of our peoples came out of the UK. How ridiculous is that? And yet that's that's the main point of his argument, and it has to do with the fact that at one time this area had a common group of people, and when Kiev was the capital of Kievan Rus way back in history, there was a move north to Moscow. Now this was around 1100 AD. So we're not talking about anything that's even reasonably recent. This is 1100 AD. So Kiev has a history going back to 482 AD, and Moscow was not formed until, I believe it's 1152 AD. And then the capital was moved, and the reason it was moved was because of Eastern Mongol tribes under Genghis Khan coming in to infiltrate this area and bring a great deal of violence and pillaging and murder and so forth. So it was because it was actually a response to them being repeatedly attacked. And this land has been contested and attacked for many, many years in many different ways. So I'm going to fast forward now to the formation, actually, of the Soviet Union, when Lenin and the Bolsheviks in 1917, in very violent political and military moves, took over what was the Grand Duchy of Russia and got rid of the Tsar and the imperial family and so forth. And during that period of time, Ukraine considered itself separate from Russia and was clearly making a stand that they were separate from Russia and that they had their own identity. And they were then known as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic starting in 1922. They tried to stand as an independent state completely separate from the Soviet Union, but that became impossible. But they have always considered themselves separate from Russia. The complicating fact is that there's a lot of families that have relatives on both sides of the border. And I can tell you from my conversations with my friends here over the last days and indeed over the last months in Ukraine that the Russian people do not want this invasion. In fact, a lot of the Russian soldiers don't even know, they did not even know why they were being ordered into Ukraine. But what they were being told was that there was a mafia-style government that was oppressing the people, and that the people of Ukraine were crying out for freedom to Mother Russia, and just a complete whole pack of lies that was then put out over their media and was glorified in their media and made it sound as if Mother Russia was coming to rescue the Ukrainian people from this very evil leadership Nothing could be further from the truth. They tried to tell people that there was child trafficking among these leaders and so forth and so on. That might have been true back when the Russian puppet was in place back in 1991 through the early 2000s, but I can tell you that that's not what's going on there now. The people are very much behind their government. They're very much in favor of their government, and their government is standing strong for them. Zelensky has refused to leave Kyiv. He was offered to be airlifted out by the United States, and he turned that down. He wants to stand and fight with his people. He's making a brave stand along with all of the government officials. They're refusing to leave the capital city. These people are literally fighting for their lives and fighting for their country. They are underarmed. They do not have the same kind of offensive weapons that Russia does. They basically have more defensive type weapons, and they're outnumbered and outgunned at least 10 to 1. So I want to, again, just remind you that these people are the victims. They are not in any way wanting Vladimir Putin and the Russian troops in their country. And most of the Russian troops that have been captured so far were completely and totally unaware of why they were even being ordered into Ukraine, other than this pack of lies that was put forward by the leadership of Russia. So this has been a much invaded land. If we go back, I started to tell you about the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic starting 1922. If you come forward to 1932 is when Ukraine suffered the loss of almost 4 million people. The estimates are from 3,900,000 to 3,985,000 people. Almost 4 million people were starved to death on purpose by Joseph Stalin as he took control to impose collectivism and a totally communist economy. So in taking over the economy, his goal was to destroy nationalism. And I think it's really important for everyone who is a small business person who hears my voice to really carefully think about what I'm going to say next and what happened in Ukraine because of Soviet oppression and government overreach. This was a man-made famine that led to mass starvation and the elimination of individually owned and operated farms. There were over 50,000 farm families, which meant somewhere around 250 to 300,000 people that were deported to Siberia. So they took these people off of their own land, off of their own farms, where they were producing not only for themselves, but for their community where they lived. And they had the same kind of community type things that we have, where we have farmers markets and people trade with one another and people do business with one another, and there's no one starving. So this was not a starvation that came because of war. It did not come because of any kind of natural calamity. It came completely and totally as a man-made famine engineered by Joseph Stalin to impose a totally communist economy and collectivism. So he wanted all these small farms and took them over in order to make them one huge collective, where then the people would not even have their own land anymore, and they would basically work as serfs or slaves for Mother Russia, right? So not only did they take these people off of their farmland and ship them to Siberia and starve almost 4 million people, they confiscated the grain of the people who remained there, who were working for them, for not meeting their quotas. So here's the stupidity of communism. They take the private means of production, they collectivize it, they remove the people who have the will and to work, and then they make them slaves in order to work for the government. And after they do that, they come in and they actually control access to food and services. And so they confiscated books, they arrested teachers and instructors. They always come against those who might have some sort of an opinion that goes against their narrative. And so they move very quickly to try to control the narrative and to censor any other voice. Are you listening to me? Are you hearing what I'm saying? Are you seeing what's happening in our country? There is censorship that's going on of any other voice that speaks up against the lockstep narrative that is being financed by the CCP and by other forces such as George Soros in this country. There are people who have sold out to the Chinese Communist Party. And our country needs to wake up and see what's going on and realize that the same kind of thing could happen here. We say, oh, it never will, because we have our Constitution, and we have seen the imposing of lockdowns under mandates that were given as emergency measures to the point where the rights of private citizens were taken away, to the point where in the first 4 months of the pandemic, people were arrested on beaches in Hawaii, even if they were seated 200 yards from the nearest person. And then they tried to say they were following the science. Well, we all know at this point that that's not true. So then we see what's happening in Australia. And we see people who are being wrestled to the ground, having their legs broken, having their heads caved in, simply because they don't have their third booster. We see people being eliminated from being able to go into stores because they don't have their third booster. Then we see what's happened in Canada. And what has happened in Canada is an atrocity. It is an absolute well, I can't use that word. It's the most horrendous thing that could happen to any free society. Let me put it that way. That's a polite way to put it. Canada not only attacked people that it said were, stopping its ability to do commerce across bridges into the United States, specifically the Ambassador Bridge, which I'm very familiar with. I went across that bridge once or twice a week every summer as a kid, because I grew up in the suburbs outside of Detroit, and we had a cabin over in Canada. So that's the bridge that goes from Windsor, Ontario, Canada to Detroit, across the Detroit River. Well, they shut it down, and they did that in protest because what was happening was, even though they had their 2 vaccinations, they had their vaccination and their booster, they were being forced to quarantine when they came back into Canada just because they had gone over into the United States to offload product. Now, when they pull in, they're the only one in their cab, and they're offloaded by forklifts, and then they turn around and they come right back across the river. But in spite of the fact that they didn't come in contact with people, they were wearing a mask and they had 2 shots, they were still being treated this way by their own government. Well, enough was enough, and they had a huge protest. Unfortunately, some of our media actually spun that in a direction that made it look like they were somehow violent. Well, the reality is that they had troops that came in that were not even local police. They had many reports of UN troops being there, people who didn't even speak the language, and who came in and who were in very, very fascist form, clearing people from the streets. Now, I'm not talking about the truckers at this point. The truckers got towed away and that all got cleared up. But the protests in Ottawa, the capital, continued to the point where they were breaking legs on the street, and a woman walking down the street who wanted to go for coffee was assaulted by the police. She filmed it with her phone, and they ended up assaulting her further, right on camera. And this kind of violence towards people, this separating into different classes within society, this spirit of division is a very dark, very, very dark spiritual forces are working in our world right now. And I think it's time for all of us to wake up and maybe get our heads out of the sand. And I know that it's easy out here in the middle of the Pacific to just say, hey, it's another beautiful day, let's go to the beach, let's catch some waves. But it's important for us to stand for our freedoms before they are taken away. And it's very important that we hold government at every level accountable, and that we watch carefully who's doing what and who wants to hand our rights away and who is standing up for our rights. So I'm going to go forward from this time. This time I was talking about, this mass starvation, is called the Holodomor. And the Holodomor, this means in Russian is Golodomor, is how they say it, but it means a purposeful famine. They call it the terror famine. It means starvation, really forced starvation. So this was back from 1932 to 1933, and this was actually fought in the United Nations from actually being called a genocide by Russia for many years. As you just saw, they just voted on the Security Council to overturn the ordinances of the vote of the Security Council, but because Russia is sitting in a position to be able to do that, they vetoed this action by the United Nations to condemn what was happening in Ukraine with the invasion of a sovereign democratic nation. The people elected their president, the people love their president there, and the people are fighting for their lives and for their nation. So don't believe any of the disinformation that's coming out in the press. Don't believe any of the disinformation that is coming out in social media. I can tell you this for sure. If Putin's mouth is moving, he's lying. If Putin's mouth is moving, he is lying. And the only way that he can make a claim towards this land is going back 1,000 years. And he sees himself as being like the Viking king, Prince Rurik, who ruled over these peoples when they couldn't actually bring peace to themselves. This area has a history of having, in the past, in the distant past, various forces that were vying for control of this area. It comes from the Black Sea up the Dnieper River, and interestingly enough, there were actually Vikings who came all the way from the Norse countries, came down through the North Sea, came down into the Mediterranean, sailed all the way across the Mediterranean, up through the Bosporus Straits there at Istanbul, and came into the Black Sea, and then went all the way up the Dnieper River. And so there is actually a mixing of the Slavic and the Scythian bloodlines. And there was at one point a prince called Rurik, and Putin has actually likened himself to this Prince Rurik. It was because the people really weren't getting along within that area, and so they actually made a request for this strong leader to come in and establish rule and order. This is how he's trying to justify what he's doing in killing civilians and taking a democratic nation with an elected government and trying to destroy them. Now, I want to go forward from the Holodomor of 1932 to 1933 and tell you just a little bit about what the Nazis did in Ukraine. And that occurred in 1941. It's called the Babi Yar Massacre, in which 35,000 Ukrainian Jews were stripped and machine gunned in a ravine west of Kiev. Between 1941 and 1943, Germany had invaded from what is now Poland, come into Ukraine, and of course they were fighting on their eastern border with Russia, on their northern border with Russia. Germany was invading every single part of Europe, essentially. and this was their eastern campaign. They came in and they took over the country, and they killed thousands and thousands of people. Between 1941 and 1943, they killed Jews, they killed Soviet officials who had been there at every single level within the land, even people who were governors of small cities, anyone who was in any way connected to the Soviet oversight of this area. So essentially, they just killed off everyone who had any kind of ability to help the society to run. And they also killed off the Russian prisoners of war that were there. So 35,000 Ukrainian Jews were machine gunned in a ravine just to the west of Kyiv in 1941. So again, these people are freedom-loving people who have been the victims time and time again. And I am just coming before you today to plead with you to pray for the nation of Ukraine. I have many friends there. I've been in touch with them, and they are in basements. They are hiding in saunas. They are fleeing the country. They're bumper to bumper. Perhaps you've seen some of the news reports, but they are also fighting. And Putin doesn't care if he hits civilian targets. Originally, he said he was going after military targets, but he blew up in the middle of winter their civilian oil supplies, and he knew that they were civilian, not military. They were not connected to any military facility or anything else, and he blew up some of their largest oil reserves, and he's coming against infrastructure in the country to take away their heat, to take away their water. He is doing things that basically, I believe, should be harshly condemned by every person and every nation. I would like to ask that you would pray in some very specific ways. I would like to ask you to pray that the God who loves them just as much as he loves you and me would graciously put a spirit of division within the Russian troops, a spirit of confusion within the Russian troops, that natural calamities would occur to thwart their efforts, and that there would be a protection over the civilians of Ukraine. I want to ask you to pray for strength for the Ukrainian people. I want to ask you to pray specifically that the munitions that are really too late, the countries are lining up now to say, oh yes, we'll send troops, just because there's public sentiment in that direction. But they had the opportunity to do this for years, for the last 8 years. And in fact, for the last 8 months, Russia was on the border of Ukraine in April. They were back on the border again this fall. All the nations of the world have had an opportunity to send military aid in seeing exactly what Putin was thinking about. And he's been pushing the limits, pushing the borders, and now he's come in a massive invasion. And so now they're saying, oh yes, they're just like politicians. They go whichever way the public sentiment goes, and they try to make themselves look good. But in reality, they've been doing hardly anything to really help. And one of the worst things that happened is when our current administration allowed Nord Stream 2, which had been shut down by the last administration. Nord Stream 2 is a gas pipeline that goes from Russia directly down to Germany under the water of the North Sea. A lot of this invasion is actually over gas and oil, because there's a gas and oil pipeline that goes right across from Russia and goes right across the nation of Ukraine and supplies Western Europe. It's their largest supply of oil and gas. And it's what has kept Putin from invading in the past, because he knows that they have control over this pipeline. They could destroy his pipeline. Well, as soon as he had an alternate to that pipeline, he felt that he could actually come in and take over Ukraine. And the whole reason that Nord Stream 2 was built in the first place, contrary to some people's analysis, was entirely and totally so that Putin could establish another source of supply to the Western European nations to sell his gas and oil. That's his biggest export. It's the biggest part of his economy, and the Russian economy is not doing well. And so what is he doing? He's going after another country because he felt suddenly safe with Nord Stream 2 being approved again. A very, very bad move on the part of our administration. And what it did, it opened up this attack. It gave Putin the guarantee that he needed to feel like he was safe in doing an invasion, in spite of the fact that his pipeline goes right across Ukraine. So folks, the bottom line is the people of Ukraine have been an oppressed and attacked people for many years. They are fighting for their country, fighting for their families, fighting for their lives, fighting for democracy. They love their administration. And so don't buy into any of the disinformation that's coming forward out of the Russian trolls and the different sources that are on social media and even through our own news media. Right now, the attack is taking place in such a way to where large areas are being invaded from areas that were formerly held. This area down here, Mariupol, is under attack right now. It's a large city down on the Sea of Azov, and they want to build a land bridge coming across to Crimea, which they have had under their control now since 2014. Up in the north, Kharkiv and Sumy are under tremendous attack. This area is coming down from Russia itself, and then there's a large force that is coming down from Belarus. As you probably know, or maybe if you follow the news, maybe you do know, maybe you don't know, had huge protests against their president, who is a very oppressive Russian-backed individual, and that was happening this last summer and last spring. These people want freedom. They don't want to be under the boot heel of these tyrants. And I'm afraid that if we are not careful in America, we are going to see further amounts of government overreach, which basically means the violation of human rights by people handed power that they shouldn't have had. And history tells us that when you hand lower level politicians and bureaucrats power that goes beyond their constitutional and administrative rights, they rarely hand it back. So I'm encouraging people to be very, very vigilant and to realize that when censorship is taking place, the narrative is being controlled, and they want to restrict certain classes of people from access to services and food. You're talking about the same exact things that have always taken place in communist countries when they take over. And we would be foolish to think that there is not a large amount of influence within our country from the Chinese Communist Party. It is a fact that China is the second largest landowner of farmland in the United States, second only to Bill Gates. And please go check me on that. Bill Gates is the largest owner of farmland in the United States, controlling the means of production of food. And in addition to that, The Chinese Communist Party is right behind him, number 2 in the number of acres held of farmland in the United States. So, brothers and sisters, fellow Hawaiians, please be heads up on what's going on, and please pray against these Russian forces that are coming down to try to take Kyiv. They are surrounding the city at this point. They're coming on the roads that come in from Kharkiv and from Sumy, and they're making a move down from all directions towards Kyiv in order to try to take the government out. And the people of Ukraine want to be free. So please pray specifically that God intervenes, that people are protected, that people can get out, and that the military force of Ukraine is able to repel this terrible aggression and war that was being called a special operation by Putin, as if it was some sort of little local thing to save someone or go in and take someone back from terrorists, when in fact it's a full-on declaration of war with invasion coming from every single part of the border of Ukraine. The only place where they're not attacked is on the border with Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and parts of Romania and Moldova. Again, this part right here of Moldova is actually from the river over to the border, is actually controlled by Russia, and they have Russian troops in this area. So from here all the way and to here, and then from Crimea and the eastern part, this whole area is in their sights. So please do pray for Ukraine. Thank you for watching today, and please be with us the next time that we come forward with Dr. Gregg Talks Story. And we're going to be talking about more having to do with Event 201, more having to do with what's going on and what they have found out now as fact regarding the origins of the virus, the handling of the pandemic, whether it's been successful or not, which countries have done better than other countries by using different methods. Thank you, and have a great day.